the lecture for those who aren't with us. And then let me get this shared. Okay. So on Tuesday, we left off talking about the nation state. So when it came to the definition of a state, we're talking about the actual boundaries and borders of a country. We're talking about an established um, country in a sense. Then when we looked at nations by themselves, nations are basically unofficial boundaries or groupings of people based on similarities in culture, which that could be similarities in language, traditions, it could be religious beliefs, whatever it may be. It's just something that unifies those people. Um, and then we got to this concept of what's known as the nation state. The nation state is when you pretty much combine those. And having a nation state is where, say, for example, people in Iceland. Iceland has a group of people who live there who have similar language, similar religious beliefs. It's pretty overwhelmingly the same. Not as much, not a lot of diversity, and it's an official country. So the entire country, the entire state, is similar across the board. That's what makes it a nation state. Now, the United States essentially is, um, oops. Oh, by the way, this is just an open-ended Zoom. I'm not requiring you guys have the video on or anything like that. So if you end up leaving, just keep in mind if you're going to leave to go for the use the restroom or whatever you may end up doing. Um, just keep in mind that you'll want to, if you miss a good portion of the Zoom, you want to make that up or watch this, the recorded version. Um, yeah, because next week I'll try to encourage a little more like open-ended some questions and some collaboration to actually hear from you guys. But today we're just kind of getting used to this format. But yeah, that's a good question. Don't feel like you have to like be like, oh, I have to ask if I can leave the Zoom. If you need to come and go, that's up to you. But um, I'm not going to be keeping track of that. Um, anyway, so yeah, so that's what a nation state is. The United States um, outwardly doesn't appear as a nation state, just considering how diverse we are in terms of our beliefs, ideologies, and religious beliefs, whatever it may be. But then I know on Tuesday it was brought up this idea that um, in a way we could be considered a nation state because we do have similar beliefs when it comes to political freedoms. That even though we have diversity in our country, we still have a common belief that you have the right to be diverse, that you have the right to have your own your beliefs or whatever it may be. Um, and so, in a way, we could be considered a nation state. Um, but generally speaking, outwardly speaking, um, we don't right away meet that definition because a better example of a nation state would be like Iceland, Greenland, and so forth. So then we get to what's known as a stateless nation. So I can't remember. We talked about the Kurds with Unit 1. Um, and the Kurds will touch on more in this unit. But essentially, we're talking about basically um, a nation of, of people. So a nation, those have similar beliefs, language, religion, whatever it may be, similarity, but they don't have their own state. They don't have their own country. And the Kurds, as you can see with the map, they have tried to fight for their own state, especially after World War One, which they were promised their own state, but didn't work out. And instead, several other states were drawn up to divide up the Kurds. And even though they now still have unity through their nation, their national beliefs, they just don't have their own state. which is problematic because we know that the conflict in Syria, we looked at how divided and fragmented that conflict is. The Kurds add to that, and have if the Kurds had their own state, there's a good chance that they would not be involved in that conflict in Syria. Um, but there are other examples of stateless nations. Currently, technically, people living in Crimea are part of stateless nation because they have similar language and ideological beliefs. And even though they've been adopted by the Russian government, the rest of the global community doesn't necessarily recognize that official state distinction, and so um, they are a stateless nation in a sense. So there's some other examples as well that we can get into next week. Then that brings us to what's known as autonomous regions. So these are kind of the bridge between stateless nations and states or nation states. Autonomous regions are areas that are defined as an area of a country that has freedom from an external authority. We're not doing that think, compare, share, but maybe if you want to think about that just on your own, what would be some examples of an autonomous region? Um, so, um, based off of that definition, if just on your own, if you can think of any any um, examples of autonomous regions, whether that be here in the United States or in other parts of the world. Um, Now, one good example of an autonomous region in the United States are Native American reservations. Native American reservations are constitutionally protected uh, by the U.S. Constitution, in which um, there's land set aside, reservations that are in the territory of the United States, the confines of the state of the United States, but they have a lot more freedom and autonomy. Um, Autonomy meaning, you know, essentially freedom from um, the United States than the actual states do. Um, so let's go ahead and look at a map of reservations, um, autonomous regions in the United States. So as you can see, we have hundreds of reservations around the United States, across the United States. And with these reservations, um, they have these freedoms and ability to set up their own, say, criminal justice systems, way of prosecuting criminals. They have their own ability to set up their style of government, so tribal government. They have the ability to set and pass their own laws, even if they contradict with federal and state laws. So, a good example in Idaho, there are a couple reservations that house casinos. And we can get into talking about um, why a lot of Native American reservations have casinos. It's pretty much a um, source of revenue. Reservations typically are on land that's not optimal for agriculture. There's not a lot of economic opportunities. We see a lot of poverty in Native American reservations. And with that autonomy, the federal government doesn't really provide a lot of funding um, compared to, say, the states when it comes to reservations. And so they are kind of tasked with raising their own revenue, tax revenue, to support their reservation. And so one way of doing that, if we just talk about capitalist structure, um, a reservation can open up a casino, say in a state like Idaho, which doesn't allow casinos to be built and run in the state, but they can open up one on their reservation territory, and people from all over the state can come to the reservation and gamble, even if it's outlawed in the rest of the state. Um, Now, with it being an autonomous region, because it sounds like they're already their own country, their own state. But then again, they're in the territory of the United States, and the way to access reservations is you have to go through the United States. And if you go and visit a reservation, you don't have to bring a passport. You're technically not leaving the United States, even though you're entering sovereign land, sovereign territory. Um, so this is just a really good example of what it means to be an autonomous region. Um, and what distinguishes it from a nation state. Even though, say, you're part of the Navajo Nation, um, and you believe in Navajo traditions, and there's an ethnic component to that. Um, you don't have your own country. You have your own autonomy, your own freedom from most federal government overreach, and um, no overreach from state government, but you still are in the confines of the United States. Australia also deals with this issue too with Aborigines, um, the native inhabitants of the continent country of Australia, and they have a similar structure in place. Though Australia, it, native Australians are they have less rights, less autonomy from the federal government of Australia than Native Americans here in the United States. Another good example of autonomous regions is in the Russian Federation. So the Russian Federation is comprised of what are known as oblasts, which are pretty much like states throughout the country, but then there are also respubliks, which are republics. And for example, number 14 here, this is the Respublik Yakutsk, um, the Republic of Yakutsk. It is a primarily indigenous, Siberian indigenous um, swath of land, which has a lot different cultural traits when it comes to ideologies and religious beliefs than most of Russia has. And so, one way of kind of alleviating potential conflict is that the Russian government said, okay, well, we're going to establish you as a republic. You can have your own style of government, um, and you can pretty much pass your own laws, do what you want to do, but you're still in the confines of the Russian Federation. Putin is still your president, but you have a lot more freedoms than, say, the Leningrad region state near St. Petersburg. Um, So this is just another example. You see all these different republics, they have autonomy from the Russian government, but they're still in the confines of the Russian Federation. And then that brings us to kind of the opposite, or it kind of leads us into what's going on here with a multinational state. So you can have states that have huge amounts of diversity and have several different nations. Um, Now, in the United States, we are not a multinational state because we don't have, like, say, you go to the Northwest and there's only one type of religion practiced there, and everybody speaks a different language than the Southeast. That's what makes the United States not a multinational state. But um, the former Yugoslavia, which during the Soviet Union existed as one full state, but as you can see, it included a lot of different nations like Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia. And within each of these nations, they had kind of a sense of unity, a sense of nationalism, um, which meant that, I am a Croatian or I am a Slovenian, which distinguished, um, them from other nations. But the problem is that this caused a lot of conflicts because say, identify as um, if you identify as a Slovenian and you have some Croatians potentially moving into your territory, into predominantly Slovenian area, then you may not want them to be there because maybe Croatians have a different religious belief than you. This is especially prevalent between Serbians and Bosnians. Bosnians being primarily um, Muslim, while Serbians being Christian. And there's a religious conflict between those groups, and they're always competing with each other. So the question came down to under the Soviet Union, they had a lot of conflicts they had to deal with this, a lot of wars between these nations, and they came down to, okay, what do we do? What do we do with this state? And ultimately, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, we had the formation of individual states like the country of Slovenia, the country of Croatia, and the country of Bosnia and um, country of Serbia. That's one way of alleviating conflicts, is that now these territories, these states are given their own boundaries, their own territoriality, and they know that they don't have to go in conflict with Croatia, for example, between Slovenia and Croatia. They don't have to go to conflict between each other because they know they have formal set boundaries. And if one invades the other, then they have a right to retaliate. But the likelihood of that happening is lower in a situation like this. So how did we get to the idea of a state? What brings us to um, formulate borders and establish boundaries, become the state. So the state came about, the modern idea of a state came about around 15 and 1600s, where we see the rise of empires like the Portuguese, Spanish, French, German, and British empires. And as these empires are growing, expanding their territory, it was important to um, hexagons. Do you want to clarify that, Tegan? Oh, or is this something? Okay, never mind. It's after class. Um, but anyway, so the idea of a modern of a state really came about out of Europe. Um, and once these empires started expanding and claiming more territory, there was a need to establish boundaries so that these empires wouldn't fight with each other for territory, at least in the continent of Europe. And so once a formal boundary was established, then each state knew that they couldn't um, you know fight with each other, that there was a little line that you can't cross. Obviously those you know didn't prevent all types of conflict, because those states were always in a sense of conflict throughout the 1700s. But really the shift in actually claiming territory and starting the idea of having a nation um, started to really radically change society's view of government. What we have in the 1700s is the Enlightenment, which is an era of kind of political revolution and political theory and political thought. Is that we have Europe full of monarchs, where these monarchs are claiming divine right, absolute right to rule the people. That they are a king or a queen because God told them that. God wants them to be the king or queen. That um, the people don't really have any rights. Then we get the advent of political philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, which we'll cover next week, where they um, really started defining what it means to be part of the state. What is your role in the state? Um, and for example, John Locke, who is kind of the basis of American ideology, American political thought, really advocated that you have the right to have individual freedom, that you have the right to um, govern yourself instead of having an absolute ruler, where Hobbes still believed that God played a major role in determining who is a ruler or not. um, but by the 1600s we have the first removal of absolute monarchy in England. We have the establishment of constitutional monarchy, where the king or queen has pretty big amount of power, but the people can still check back against the king or queen if they're really stepping out of line. That was revolutionary movement in England. You guys know what today is by chance? I just remember this. So it's November 5th, and you may have, if anybody's ever watched the movie V for Vendetta, um, there's a famous poem, remember the 5th of November. the gun plot and treason. I cannot think of any reason why the gun plot and treason should ever be forgot. In 1600s, there was a um, guy known as Guy Fawkes, and he was very upset with um, with the monarch, with the monarchy and the king's government, that he attempted to blow up the royal court, the parliament in London. His plot was foiled by the king's guards, and he was executed. But he tried to blow up Parliament on November 5th, and that event is looked towards as, for a lot of revolutionaries, as a symbol of fighting back against the modern state, or the former state. Anyways, that's me going on a little bit of a tangent. But happy Guy Fawkes Day, November 5th. Okay. So with the rise of the modern state, its origins, its roots can really be traced back even prior to the 1600s. With the Norman invasion of 1066, we have the production of a whole new political order. We have more cohesiveness when it comes to states. Um, then we start seeing kind of a shift in the economics, the economy. Prior to the Dark Ages, what was the main type of or main form of the economy? We had you know, feudalism. We had very limited form of capitalism that they hadn't really identified yet, but for the most part, you lived in a kingdom and you traded within that kingdom. You traded between villages. Um, there wasn't really a strong international market yet, only for really rare items in the Far East. But then we get kind of the advent of capitalism, which comes into play once empires start growing in the 1600s, and uh, capitalism really starts driving this idea of having individual states and having those states trade with each other. Um, and once Western Europe's kind of really strong monarchies start to crumble and fracture, uh, then we start seeing the state really form, and forms of government being established in Western Europe. Now, one thing that really helped identify or come or bring the modern state into the spotlight is the advent of colonialism. So we talked about how empires were rising. The way that these empires were growing is through colonialism, which colonialism, and let me move, so you guys can get this definition. We move the, actually, oops, I'll go ahead and just minimize that for now. Um, Colonialism is a physical action in which one state takes over control of another, taking over the government and ruling the territory as its own. Now, there's going to be a big distinction between colonialism and imperialism because we talk about imperialism a little bit next week. Um, Imperialism is not the same as colonialism. Colonialism is kind of what we think of, where a country, a state such as say England, Great Britain, goes into say um, I'm trying to think of um, a better example would be Spain. Think of Spain going into the Mayan territory in the Americas or in Central America, um, and going in and basically um, setting up shop and forcing the people who live, the Mayans, to conform to Spanish beliefs and customs or die. That's pretty much the option. Basically, assimilate and force the people to now become a part of Spain. And the Spanish are going to use those people, are going to use the resources of the land, um, conquer it, control it, and use those resources for the benefit of the Spanish Empire, um, or for Spain in general. Um, Now, the reason that a lot of these European countries and states were able to go into these um, parts of the world and colonize them, there were a couple of reasons. Main one is that the lack of technology, advanced weaponry from these other regions in the world. Um, they, it was difficult for um, a civilization like the Mayans to, or the Aztecs to really fight off the advanced weaponry of the Spanish. Though they did put up a fight. The Aztecs and Mayans put up a severe fight against the Spanish, but ultimately the Spanish prevailed with their technology. Another reason was that there wasn't a lot of unity amongst these areas being colonized. They didn't really have structured government. They didn't have structured system, and so you had tribes, say in Africa, um, that were fighting each other, and then they had to fight um, these colonizers from Britain, and they didn't have a way to strongly fight back against the Europeans because they didn't have a strong sense of unity or an established state of their own. Okay, so I have a video. I have to actually go out to YouTube for this one. Um, just brace yourselves. I know sometimes in Zoom it might come out really loud, um, so just make sure to adjust your volume accordingly. But We're gonna watch a quick video going over um, colonialism, and then we're gonna talk about it a little bit, and then we'll finish off with video about um, World War II. So let's learn a little bit about colonialism.
Sorry, are we supposed to hear the video?
Yeah. Do you guys not hear it?
I can't hear it.
Okay, I think I forgot to check the box. Okay, let me see.
The world we live in today is
You
quite
guys hear it now?
special. Special in the sense that we're all connected in one
Yeah, I can hear
way or another.
Yeah.
For example, you could easily buy a plane ticket and get to the other side of the world in less than a day, or use technology to send a video of your cat to your relatives in Minnesota. But the world wasn't always like this. Many important events and movements led to the development of the world we know and sometimes love. Today, we will look at one of them. Colonialism occurs when one nation subjugates another nation, often forcing their culture and language upon the local population. Colonialism is a policy that closely relates to imperialism, but they do differ slightly. Imperialism is about controlling a country or countries, often with military forces, while colonialism is more about expanding the host country's influence and setting up colonies. The motivation for colonialism could often be boiled down to three things: God, gold, and glory. God, in the sense that European colonizers believed that it was their duty to spread Christianity and its teaching. Gold, in the sense that colonizers wanted to find trading routes and untap natural resources. And glory, in the sense that there was a bit of a competition between European nations to see who could set up the most colonies. Though colonialism was practiced in ancient times by ancient empires such as the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians, we'll be only focusing on colonialism during and after the Age of Discovery. In the 15th century, Portugal began looking for new trading routes and civilizations. This led to the conquest of North Africa, where Portugal managed to colonize some coastal territories and islands. This kick-started modern colonialism. Spain, now envious of Portugal's success, sent out missionaries of their own. One of those missionaries was Christopher Columbus, the first known European to land on the shores of America. As a result of that, Spain managed to set up colonies in the Bahamas and Caribbeans. Soon after, other European nations such as England, the Netherlands, France, and Germany sent out missionaries of their own, in the hopes of finding new land, new trading routes, and set up colonies of their own. This whole sequence became known as the first wave of colonial expansion. The second wave of colonial expansion would come during the 19th century. It would center around the African continent in what was known as the Scramble for Africa. European nations such as England, France, Portugal, and Spain divided up the African continent, creating border and boundaries while claiming large swaths of land for themselves. But that wasn't all that happened. The practice of colonialism did not come without its fair share of ramifications, positive and negative. Host countries often invested into their colonies into areas such as infrastructure or trade. Oftentimes, they would share their medical practices and technology as well. Technologies such as guns, transportation, and agricultural instruments. And in some specific case, host countries even pushed for the adoption of human rights standards, democratic practices, and governmental institutions. These were the positive effects of colonialism, but with the positives also came the negatives. Colonies could not be set up without facing any kind of resistance. Obviously, the locals weren't happy with foreign people coming into their land and forcing them to change their ways. This would often lead to resistance and bloodshed. Colonizers would often disregard the culture and heritage of the local people. They would set up colonies mixing distinct and sometimes clashing groups of people together. Furthermore, they would often treat these people like second-class citizens and excluded them from participating in their own government. Colonizers would violate human rights, spread foreign disease, and create heavy instabilities in their colonies. Another negative of colonialism was the treatment of the environment. Colonizers would often take natural resources, some of which important to the local population, for themselves. They would destroy natural habitats to create space for farms and plantation. This created a culture that is still relevant in some post-colonial countries today, where natural resources would be brought and sold, and natural habitats would be destroyed for farms and plantations. It's impossible to talk about the effects of colonialism without bringing up the transatlantic slave trade. By the late 15th century, Portuguese ships were transporting North African slaves for use on sugar plantations in their colonies. Soon after, Spanish colonizers began transporting African slaves to the Caribbean, marking the start of the transatlantic slave trade. Other European nations, such as the Netherlands, England, and France, would also do the same. The African slaves used in the slave trade were often brought from warlords or tribes, or sometimes even taken forcefully. This led to rapid depopulation and created an atmosphere filled with unrest and violence, an atmosphere where people couldn't trust each other because of the fear of being sold out. Decolonization is a process in which colonies became independent from their host countries. There are many ways for colonies to become independent, the two main ones being through revolution or through the host country withdrawing. It's not uncommon to see nations fighting for their independence and being successful, such as the Americans in 1776 and the Haitians in 1781. But a majority of colonies gained their independence during the international period of decolonization, beginning in 1914 and ending in 1975. After World War II, many European superpowers lacked the wealth and resources to uphold their overseas colonies. They also faced challenges against the world's new superpower, the Soviet Union and the United States, both of which were against colonialism. Many colonies fighting for their independence would often appeal to the United States for support. The United States being a country which supports national self-determination and a country which was once a colony. The United States would often send support in the form of aid, technical assistance, or sometimes even military interventions. In 1946, the United Nations had 35 members, but as many nations gained independence from their colonizers, this number went up to 127 in 1970. These new members of the United Nations became vocal advocates for decolonization, pushing the United Nations towards accepting independence from colonial states and to work towards ending the colonialism era. Colonialism has
Okay. So pretty much with colonialism, this is something that we'll be talking into next week, and for a good portion of this unit. Colonialism has had some benefits, but overwhelmingly is a pretty um, negative I got to put words in my mouth. Colonialism has had a lot of consequences. A lot of bad things has happened as a result of colonialism. Foremost is kind of the impact on the people being colonized. Usually, those being colonized were killed as a result of conflict of war from the colonizer to the diseases being brought. Um, but some other negative impacts we have kind of instability being brought about, mistrust between the colonizers, um, and then ultimately, once these colonizers left, if it wasn't through revolution, they would, like for example, Britain ended up abandoning most of their colonial interests after World War II. What was left in the colony, the former colony, was a lot of instability and um, ultimately conflict. Did somebody have a question? Um, so, all right. What I know we're a little late here. I'm gonna go ahead and show this last clip here. Let me pull it up. So we're going to kind of start transitioning because we now understand different types of states, what distinguishes a nation between, say, an autonomous region, and then how now we have to kind of look at how states interact with each other in a more modern era. But to understand how modern states interact with each other, a lot of conflicts, a lot of borders, disputes, or just border makeup come as a result of the end of World War II. But to understand the end of World War II, we need to understand what triggered World War II and um, how the colonization played a role into the war, and just how the sense of a modern state um, started the war. So, like some new ideologies came as a result, like fascism, communism became very popular in the spotlight as a result of World War II. Because then after World War II, we have the advent the um, of the Soviet Union as a major world superpower. Um, let's see here. So, um, all right. So this is, like I said, this video. There's a couple cases of like a little like very mild um, swearing, or like nothing that you probably haven't heard before. Nothing that sure isn't outlawed for a ninth grade class. But once again, this is very oversimplified. You guys will learn a lot about World War I and World War II in your world history classes, um, European history, and U.S. history. But for the sake of human geography, it's important to kind of understand where these countries are coming from. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video, and then we'll kind of come together at the very end, talk about it, and then I'll get you guys going. So enjoy this oversimplified first part of World War II.
And learn something new today. Now, without further ado, it's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war, but his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with bold. Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, "Make me prime minister, or I'll make me prime minister." And the king said, "You and what army?" "This army." Fair enough. Then he went about establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them. I made that last one up, but it helps you understand how all this felt.
Right, hold on. I'm just gonna check the chat real quick, see what's going on. Okay. Just want to make sure there wasn't anything going on.
To Germans. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything, the German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation. He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attended a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew and grew, and in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, "You're going to trade with us and you're going to like it." Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of China's stuff. But then the West said, "Hey, cut that out." And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, "Okay, I guess we'll just go home." Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair. We don't think so. Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I, they took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia, and then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty, the first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum, or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, "I want that thing," and the Allies would say, "You can't have that thing." "Okay, you can have that thing, but no more." "I want that thing." And repeat. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria and just took it, with no resistance. Boom, this is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, "Look, we're going to give you what—" Hang on, this meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too? Anyway, we're going to give you what you want. Really? Yeah. Just like that? Yep. What's the catch? Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay. Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of peace. And we built the statue of Chamberlain every day in September to celebrate Chamberlain. He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action. He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania. Then, in another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people. Back in Europe, Germany and Italy made their relationship status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor, splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, how about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future. Sounds good. This new alliance stunned the West. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down on them from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much. The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel, and they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your arms. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans. Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the Phony War, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended, because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides, taking out France's best armies and nearly wiping out the British too. But they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous journey to bring their young men home. With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that. Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly, it didn't, and he needed to secure the Western Front, so he tried to force them into submission. with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships. So have at it. Hitler then began laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British Invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel. This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just the foot for now. Finally, the Luftwaffe sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time.
Okay, so that's just an introduction of what's going on with World War II. Next week we'll look at the second part of this and how the end of the war ended up resulting in the breakup of German occupied lands, and then we have the formation of the Soviet Union. But really, what I want to get out of this video is how we have different states with different competing ideologies and different forms of government in conflict with each other, and how one state, the German, the Third Reich, is trying to expand its territorial claims and territoriality, and invading the sovereignty of other nations or other states like Austria, and then eventually into Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, and so forth. So with that, go ahead and get this stopped here. With that, did you guys have any questions or concerns when it came to the material today? All right. Yeah, so if there's no pressing questions or issues, this will be kind of where we stop for today. Next week, we'll plan on meeting here in class on Monday during normal time, so about 12:45, and we will go to the end of class. Hopefully I'll have a little more interactive, engaging stuff for you guys to do, but we'll be looking more intensely into colonialism, talking about imperialism, and then specifically border conflicts and border establishment for the modern era. So let's see. Oh yeah, so when it came to Japan invading China, the original reason was that Japan needed resources. Japan didn't have access to oil, coal, a lot of natural resources you need to have a strong economy, strong government. And so they originally went into Korea, but the West was like, no, you guys can't do that. We're going to go to war with you if you try to invade the sovereignty of China. And so Japan was just like, well, I'm too weak. We can't put up a fight against all the military strength of the West, so we're going to stay in our island. But then all of a sudden, the West is doing what Japan wants to do in China already, just a little less obviously. So Japan's like, well, this isn't fair. So they go back and say, well, we want these resources, and so we're going to fight back against the Russians because we feel it's unfair. We can get these resources. And then, as you saw in the video, there were a couple staged events that Japan used to justify their claims in invading the rest of China. And part of it was the resources, and then the other part was just kind of for the strength, for the glory of the Japanese Empire for the emperor to have this control over the Chinese, because the Japanese and Chinese had always been in conflict with each other up to this point, but now there's this kind of racial component too, just like the Jews and the Nazis, how the Nazis um, viewed the Jews as subhuman, pretty much. The Japanese did that for the Chinese, and we won't talk about it in this unit. We will talk about it in the culture unit on how the Japanese killed more Chinese than Nazis killed Jews, and there was a lot more heinousness by the Japanese in China than the Nazis did with the Jews. So hopefully that answered the question, Grace. If there's anything else from anybody, if not, um, just reminder that there is the weekly assignment. Distance learners, you get an extra week if you're distance learning as of Tuesday. But the rest of you, there's the expectation that you get the weekly assignment done by Sunday night, 2.1 and 2.2. But we'll come back together on Monday. If there's nothing else, if you need to hang out and talk to me one-on-one, you can. But other than that, you guys are good to leave the Zoom. Have a good weekend. Oh, yeah, if you want to see the cat, he's sunbathing right now. He's probably going to be a little upset. We actually have to go get his nails trimmed because they're hurting him today. But yeah, this is Gary. Just woke up. He was sunbathing. But you'll see a lot of him. Oh, no, because next week I'll be in the classroom. But enjoy him while you can.